All right, Rabbi, say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning. Share to thank our Talmud Torah sponsor, an anonymous sponsorship, dedicating all the Sherman Drushos this month with Hakaras Hatov to Hashem. Oh, why is this not coming on? Okay, sorry about that. 1 second. Oh, there we go. With Hakaras Hatov to Hashem, for all of the blessings He has bestowed upon us, and for refuah Shleima, for Devorah Leah, bas Chaya Rivka, may we all be zoche Hashem to witness the imminent coming of mashiach. Mehera b'yameinu. Amen. Our week of learning sponsors, Milton Melanie Gertner, in honor of the wedding of their son, Drew Ari, to Shira Shamouilian in Yerushalayim, Kodesh. Our Daf Yomi sponsors for today. We wish the Chassan and Kalo, of course, incredible Mazel and Bracha, and Mev Esem Shanim Tovos. Our Daf Yomi sponsors for today, Chaim Malky Wecker, in commemoration of the 11th yahrzeit of Sy Bayuk, Shlomo ben Chaim Zvi, Zichron Bracha. For those who remember, Sy was an incredible pillar of our shul, one of our charter members of Daf Yomi, a man who, I remember again, by his 80th birthday, it highlighted the idea that he never really had the opportunity to learn when he was working. And so his first real opportunity to learn was when he started the Daf. He finished Shas, and not long after finishing Shas, passed away. An incredible man who was really such a giver and a pillar to the shul. Richard and Judy Nudelman, in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Richard's father, Yachinil's father, Yaakov ben Moshe Tzvi, and Chaim Rothschild, in commemoration of the yahrzeit of his mother, Shira Rivka bas Leyzer. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the Neshama Slam and Aliyah, the families in Nechama, all those who need a refuah should have one together with Kol Cholei Yisrael. And in Meretz Hashem, our hostages should come home Bekarov, our soldiers should be successful. B'chol Ma'aseh Yadayim, and the Kadosh Baruch Hu should give bracha and shalom to all of Am Yisrael. Well, so with that, let us begin. We have a lot to do today, some really great Gemara ahead of us, a lot of work. Baruch Shem. So today's daf is Tzadik Beis 92. We are picking up on Tzadik Aleph on Beis 91b at the bottom Mishnah. So let's say now watch this. So let's say again the worker is working with figs. The Mishnah says So in other words, the entitlement that a worker has to go ahead and consume from the produce that he is working with is dafka the produce he's working with. But let's say again in the field that he's working with grapes. But it happens to be that there are grapes and figs in the field. He's only allowed to eat from what he is actually working with and not from the other min. Okay? He's working with grapes, he can't eat from the figs. Aval, moneas atzma ad shemagia lemakom yafos, ba'ochal, we've seen this already before. What he is allowed to do is as follows. Let's say he's working with grapes. And let's remember again, we saw this before a day or two ago. And let's say again, he knows that the grapes at the end of the row are the best grapes, because those are the grapes that have access to the sun for the greatest amount of the day. So he decides, you know what? I'm not eating right now. I'm going to eat everything I want from the end of the row. Okay, he has the ability to do that. Furthermore, I'm going to say the entitlement to eat is only when the worker is actually working. It's very important. This idea, so just if you imagine just the imagery of this, so it's just illustrated with the vineyard. So the worker is going ahead and picking the grapes off the vine for his employer. So the Torah says, listen, while you're picking the grapes off, you're allowed to eat while you work. The Gemara says, Ava mishum hashev aveda lebaylim, amru polim ochlin balichasan uman leuman, ubechazirasan minagat. I will say, interestingly enough, but in order to stave off any level of financial loss for the owner, so Chazal said that the worker is even allowed to work as he's going ahead and walking from row to row, or on his way back from the vat. Now, what does this mean? Take a look at Rashi. It's actually quite interesting. So here's what's interesting. So on one hand, the typical biblical or the paradigmatic biblical entitlement for consumption is he's sitting there picking grapes off the vine. So as he's working, he's eating. What's the problem with working while you're eating, right? The pashtos is it may diminish productivity. So Chazal said something interesting. Chazal said, here's what we're going to let you do. when you're walking from row to row, so remember again, you're not, and again, the imagery over here is always with the vineyard. When you're walking from row to row, so remember again, during that time, you're not actively eating, you're not actively working. Chazal said you can go ahead and eat during that time. Look at Rashi. When you finish working in one row, and you're going to now start in another row, even though again, at that moment, when you're walking row to row, it's interesting, that's not called working. That's not called working. The Balabayas is okay with this. So just understand what the Mishnah is saying. This is fascinating. The biblical entitlement for a worker to eat is only when the worker is actively working. So you're picking the fruit. While you're picking the fruit, you're allowed to eat it. On a biblical level, when you're walking row to row, that's not called working. Now, here's what's interesting. Of course, we'll say on an employment level, it's called part of the job, right? Because remember, again, you can't continue your job if you don't walk row to row. But the idea is that the biblical entitlement to consume produce is while you're actively working. So therefore, again, this is fascinating. On a biblical level, when you're going row to row, you really shouldn't be entitled to eat from the produce. But Chazal came along and said, you're allowed to eat from the produce when you're walking row to row. Why? Because that's actually in the benefit of the Balabayas. Right? Because this way, again, as much as the biblical entitlement to eat produce is when you're actively working, from the Balabayas' perspective, I don't want you eating while you're working. I want you working while you're working. So you know what? Anyway, when you're walking row to row, so when you finish with one row of grapes, grab a cluster, and as you're walking, eat while you're walking. So interesting enough, as much as that's not the biblical entitlement, Chazal essentially worked that in to the worker's arrangement, and ultimately said that he's allowed to do that because this is in the best interest of the Balabayas. It's fascinating. And a chamar, a donkey, is permitted to eat when it is porek. Ultimately, again, when it is literally porekes means when it's holding onto its load or unloading its load. Again, we'll see what that means. Rashi says we'll see it in the Gemara. So here we go. So I will say this is an interesting question. What happens? So now, here's what we've established is, midaraisa, we've already seen this before, right? The worker's entitlement to consume produce is dafka when he's actively engaged in the work. See, here's the shaila. What happens if he's currently picking from vine A? Is he allowed to go ahead and consume produce from vine B? That's the shaila. So the Gemara says, on one hand, mamo mimin sha'ata knows in the killer shabbat abayis v'ha'ika. So we'll say the paradigm we've kind of established is, what is the worker allowed to eat? Whatever type of produce he's putting into the balabayas' basket, that's the type of produce he's allowed to consume. So in Pashtos, since he's harvesting grapes, he's allowed to go and even take from another vine, even though it's not the vine he's currently working with. Odoma, mimasha atanos in the killer shabbat abayis v'ha'ika. Or maybe no. It's not, in other words, we'll say the license over here is as follows. Whatever exactly you are taking, right, and putting into the balabayas' utensils, that's what you're allowed to eat. So it's not a species issue, but rather it's a direct produce issue. So as you hear the shaila, so again, worker is working with vine A. While he's working with vine A, is he allowed to grab produce off vine B and eat that for himself? So on one hand, we could say, if the halacha is whatever species you're working with, that's what you're allowed to eat from. So he's working with grapes, he can eat grapes. Doesn't matter from vine A, B, or C. As long as it's grapes, it's good, as opposed to figs, which he's not working with. Or no, it's dafka, the exact produce that you are harvesting, that's the produce that you're allowed to eat. In which case, if you're working from vine A, then what? You're allowed to eat from vine A and not from vine B. That's the shaila. I will say, if you say that halacha l'maisa, if you're working with one vine, you can't eat from another vine. If that's the case, shar b'mechuber hechi achel. How can you ever have a case of a shar that is consuming from attached produce? Why? Because I will say, interestingly enough, what's the role of a shar in a vineyard? Right? The role of a shar in a vineyard is that Rashi points out he's pulling a wagon, right? And they're loading produce into the wagon. While the wagon usually is behind, the shar is in front. The shar, there's no way the shar is able to eat from that which they're harvesting because he's in a different direction. So b'pashtos, anytime the shar is eating b'mechubar, he has to be eating of a different vine. So if you say that when you're working with one vine, you can't eat of another vine, then how do you ever have a case of a shar eating from attached produce? To which the Gemara says something very interesting. The Gemara says, Amar of Shisha Reid Rav Idi was a second wide line, Bisharcha. We're talking about a very long vine. Okay, so because it's a very long vine, therefore, again, even though they're working with it, perhaps it extends to the front as well, and therefore the shar is consuming of that very vine. Tashma, so we'll say, so we're still stuck with our shayla. Not stuck, we're still working through our shayla. So Tashma, the Mishnah said that if you're working with figs, you can't eat of grapes. So we'll say, what if you have a case of grapes and grapes that's like a case of grapes and figs? Now what does that mean? Just like grapes and figs are obviously two different plants, right? Vines and trees. So we'll say, so that's where it's usher. But if you have a case of grapes and grapes, like grapes and figs, for example, two vines, it sounds like that should be permitted. So it sounds like from here that a worker could consume produce as long as it's the same species of produce that he's working with, even if it's a different vine. But if you say that if a worker is working with vine A, he can't eat the vine B, how can you come up with a case of anavim va'anavim that's like anavim u'te'inim? To which the Gemara says, Rav Shishbei Ravidi bimudlis. Ultimately, again, in a case where one vine is hanging over another vine. So we'll say, so you could have a case like that where lemaisa, even though it's two different vines, they're in close proximity to each other. All right, Tashma. Aval monea as asmo achma gil makom hayafos. The Mishnah said that if the worker wants to dafka wait to eat until he gets to the area of the best grapes, he has the ability to do that. So the Gemara says, "V'i amrit ose begefen ze ocha begefen acher nezel v'nesi v'nechon." I will say this is actually very interesting. So when the Mishnah says that statement, right, that the worker could dafka work till he gets to the area of the best grapes. So what does that sound like? Right, I'm working in Ruvain's field. I know the best grapes are on the front of the row. Right now, I'm in the middle of the row. So dafka, I'm not eating right now. I'm just going to do my work. And then when I get to the front of the row, I'm going to go to town. I'm going to go to town on those front of row grapes. Someone says, I don't understand. But if the halacha is that when you're working with one vine, you can eat from another vine, so I have a great idea. Go ahead, harvest the grapes in the middle, run over to the front, grab some grapes over there, eat a little bit, and then come back and finish up and doing your work. To which the Gemara says, no, that's a different issue. Hasam mishum bittul malacha. They will say that's a different issue. That's because of bittul malacha. That's because if we allow the worker to do that, again, his productivity is going to dramatically diminish. Can you imagine this? He's working in the middle of the row, and then when he wants something to eat, he runs to the front of the row, and then back and forth and back and forth. That's bittul malacha. The Gemara says, no. Lo kami bailan. We're not asking about bittul malacha. Ki kami bailan. Hecha diika ishta ubanav mai. So I'll give you a different example. Let's say, again, I'm working in the field, and my wife and kids are there. Right? So meaning moral support. So now what's happening? I'm working in the middle of the vine. I say to my kids, you know what? Grab me some grapes from the front of the vine. So for me, there's no bittul malacha. I'm continuing to work. But I don't want to eat from the grapes that are in front of me. I want to eat from different grapes. So can I tell my kids to grab me those grapes from the front vine for my own consumption? So Tashma, v'kulam lo amra el b'shas malacha. So I'll say, remember again, what did the Mishnah say? The Mishnah said, technically speaking, the biblical entitlement to consume grapes or to consume produce is only when you are actively working. Aval, mipnei hashev avei l'baylim. But I will say, in order to stave off a loss for the owner, for the balabayas, amru polim ochlim bahalichasan me'uman lu'uman ubechazirasan min agat. They said ultimately, again, workers are allowed to eat when they go from row to row and when they come back from the vat. Savrua, and Abba said, this actually is very interesting. Savrua, mahalech ke'osa maisedami. So this is very interesting. So Chazal must hold that mahalech, walking. Now look at Rashi. It's almost right across in Rashi. Mahalech, b'tzarchei balabayis kegon zeh, belechto mi'uman lu'uman. The act of walking, right? The act of walking. I will say, so just think about this just a second. When the worker walks from row to row, is that called malacha? It's not malacha, right? It's not malacha, because remember again, malacha, what is the job he's hired for? Harvesting, that's mulacham. But yet you see that in the eyes of Chazal, that when the worker walks as part of his job, in other words, I got it. It's not the exact task for which I was hired for. But lamaisa, it's clearly part of the work. So in other words, getting from row to row is considered to be by Chazal part of the work. Ke'osa maisadami. So this is fascinating. When you are doing something that is part of the task you are hired for, even though it's not the exact task, that is tantamount and equivalent to actively working. Look at the next Rashi. Ke'osa maisadami v'yesh lo le'echol. V'yesh lo le'echol. So therefore, Rabbi say Chazal felt comfortable saying that when you walk from row to row, the worker should be entitled to go ahead and eat, right? He's not actively involved in the picking of the grapes. You're right, but mahalech, when he's walking as part of the job, ke'osamai sadami, that is equivalent to actively being engaged in work. So finish the Rashi. V'afilu hachi ilav detikon le'rabonon denechale lebalabayis midaraisa lo achal mipnei shalichasu tzorech gefen sholich etzlahu v'achilasa me'anavim shekotzeitz mizu shiyatsa mimenohu alma oseh bazeh ein ochal bazeh. So I will say, listen to how fascinating this is. So I will say, what are you thinking when I'm saying this? You're thinking to yourself, that's obvious and intuitive. Of course, walking from vine to vine is part of the job. Right? Well, I don't understand what's... So I will say, there's something really fascinating over here. The Gemara is saying like this. Let's talk about just on the Da'oraisa level, right? On the Da'oraisa level, it's clear from the Mishnah that the worker is only considered to be working when he's actively picking the grapes, right? Because look how the Mishnah read, right? So therefore the Mishnah says, Ruvain is the worker. When Ruvain is working, he's picking the grapes, he's allowed to eat because he's actively working. Then the Mishnah said, Chazal instituted that he's even allowed to eat when he goes from row to row. What? So what does that tell me? The Mid'oraisa, going row to row, is not part of the work. Now remember, of course going row to row is part of the work. What are we talking about over here? We're talking about a worker's entitlement to eat. To eat. What's the problem when the worker is going row to row? What's the problem? He left vine A and he's going to vine B. So the problem from a consumption perspective is he's really not entitled technically to eat of anything. Why? Because he's not actively engaged in the harvesting of the grapes. And when you're not actively engaged in the harvesting, you don't have a right of consumption. So Chazal stepped in and said, yes, you do. Yes, you do. Why? Because it's in the best interest of the Balabayis, because actually that's the best time to eat. That's the best time to eat, because anyway you're walking, you're not doing anything. Might as well utilize that time ultimately for consumption. What do you see from here? You see from here, they will say the fact that biblically that is not a time in which the worker is entitled to eat. What does that tell you biblically? That midaraisa, when you're working with one vine, you don't have the right to eat of another vine. The most incredible thing. Because if it was true that midaraisa, that when you're working with vine A, you can eat from vine B, then halacha l'maisa, I should have a biblical entitlement to eat while I'm walking. Because again, I'm walking from A to B, which means I should have a right to eat. The fact that midaraisa, I don't have a right to eat, and only midrabanan, I do have a right to eat, indicates that when you're working with vine A, you can't eat from vine B. Incredible. So the Gemara says, Mishum hasheva beidla bailim huda achol midaraisa lo achol alma. What do you see from here? Ose begefen zeh eino ochel begefen acher. So you see from here that Allah Chalamayim working with vine A, you don't have the right to eat from vine B. Twitch says, no, maybe not. Lo di olam eimulacha. Perhaps I would say to you, Ose begefen zeh ochel begefen acher. No, maybe in reality, when you're working with vine A, you can eat from vine B. And I will say maybe what we're saying is that walking is not considered working. Walking in the midaraisa, walking is not considered working, and that's why again there's no biblical entitlement to eat. Ikadami, others explain, Damri Savrua Mahalech Lav Kosamaisadami, that in fact walking is not like walking is not like working. The Hainu Taima, so now we understand the midaraisa lo achel mishum lav kosamaisadami. Therefore, when you're walking from row to row, midaraisa, you're not allowed to eat because midaraisa walking is not like working. Ha osamaisa achel midaraisa. But But what do you see from here? That Allah, so when you are working, you have an entitlement to consume in daraisa. Alma ose begefen ze ochal begefen acher. And therefore, again, what do you see from here? That when you're working with vine A, you can eat from vine B, which the Gemara says, both say last line, 91b. Although the olam emelachal ose begefen ze eno ochal begefen acher. No, not true. In fact, the halacha is when you're working with vine A, you are not allowed to work with vine B. Eat from vine B. Top of Tzadik Beis 92a. Umahalech ka'osa maisedami. And I will say, in fact, halacha l'maisa, walking is considered to be part of the employment. Mahalech ka'osa maisedami. And again, but I will say, but even though walking is part of the employment, remember again, I will say, being employed is not what entitles you to eat. What entitles you to eat? Actively working. And I will say, this is how the Rambam paskins. The Rambam paskins in Hilchos Schirus, Perek Yud Beis, Halacha Yud. Here we go. Get ready. Hose begefen zeh, eino ochel begefen acheres. So I will say the halacha is when you are what are you allowed to eat? When you're working with vine A, you could eat from vine A, and that's it. But when you're working with vine A, you cannot consume from vine B. I will say also just on a svara level, if you could imagine if you're working and you're allowed to eat from whatever you want, just the bidl malacha, right? The wasted time that's going to occur, right? Look at that vine over there, look at that vine over there. Suddenly you're deciding which vine you want to eat from. Say for the Torah limits the scope. You're working from vine A, you're working on vine A, you could eat from vine A, and that's it. I would say there's also tremendous Moshe Tzvi on this, if you think about this. So therefore, based on this, technically speaking, when you are going ahead and the Rambam passes this way also, when you're going ahead and walking, you shouldn't be able to eat. Right? Because again, remember, the entitlement to eat is dafka when you're actively engaged. What Chazal said is, you are allowed to eat when you're walking from vine to vine. In other words, also what that means is I'm working on vine A, I could grab a cluster, and as I'm walking to vine B, I could eat. Or I'm on the way from the vat, I could eat. So I will say, so again, that's midrabana, because midaraisa that shouldn't be true, because midaraisa you can only eat when you're actively working. Chazal said, to save time for the balabayas, you're finishing up with vine A, grab a cluster, and as you're walking to vine B, eat the grapes. I will say, what are Chazal teaching us? I will say, it's profound. It's just the incredible value of time. So Chazal understood, you're going to have this time when you are walking from vine A to vine B. I don't know, how long does it take to walk from vine A to vine B, from row A to row B? Whatever it is, I will say, those couple of moments, that's time. And time is valuable. So Chazal said, let's maximize your time. You're walking anyway. You're not working during walking, even though walking is considered working. Utilize the time. Eat the grapes then. And I will say, what a tremendous Moshe Tzvi. We often treat time like an infinite renewable resource, when in fact, time is the ultimate finite, non-renewable resource. And that is why we have to be so makbid about how we utilize it. We had this, the Piaget spoke about this. Piaget spoke about this idea in Bnei Machshava Tova. And the idea was of how every single day to make a schedule. And again, I always mention this, the Piaget says, it doesn't mean you have to be learning Torah every day. He says, you want to carve out time to socialize with your friends? Great, go for it. How much time? When is it starting? When is it ending? You're going to spend time with your family? Beautiful. Even that's not infinite. When is that starting? When is it ending? You're going to learn. Great. When is it starting? When is it ending? Make a schedule. Make sure the moments of your day are accounted for. And that's the key to successful and impactful living. Let's go weiter. Says the Gemara, Ubechamor kishu parakes. So we'll say the Mishnah said again, when is the chamor, when is the donkey permitted to eat? Kishu parakes me'echan achla. I don't understand. When you're unloading the donkey, so ultimately again, where is the donkey eating from? So the Gemara says, Ema achete parakes. No. What it means is like this. So the image over here is a donkey's carrying a load. While it's carrying its load, it's permitted to eat from that load that it's carrying. But the license to eat from that load is obviously only so long as the donkey is carrying it. Once the donkey is unloaded, it's no longer permitted to eat of its load. The Gemara says, a chamar, a donkey, and a camel are permitted to eat from the load that's on their back. So the Gemara says, as long as what you can't do, I will say, is if let's say I'm leading the donkey and the donkey's carrying a load, I can't take from the load and actively feed it to the donkey. If the donkey wants to reach back and get something, that the donkey has the right to do. So I will say, I just want to point out, up until now, we've always been focused on an animal threshing or doing farm work and eating from what's in front of it. This is a different kind of case where the animal is involved in transporting a load of food. And the halacha is that when an animal is permitted to eat from that load, the chap over here is the animal is permitted to eat from it to whatever degree the animal can access it. Right? But I'm not allowed to take from the load and actively feed it to the animal. The animal has to be able to access it itself. And furthermore, the license to consume is only so long as the animal itself is holding the load or carrying the load. Beautiful. Mishnah. Let's say very interesting, really excellent Mishnah over here. Ochel Paul Kishos Afila Bedinar, Kosos or Kosos Bedinar. Let's say, watch this. Let's say halacha, so the worker is working. And the worker gets paid $10 an hour to go ahead and do this manual labor of collecting the produce. And let's say what happens. The produce he's working with is very expensive produce. So it's interesting. The Mishnah's examples of expensive produce are cucumbers and dates, special dates. So we'll say, so now let's say again, each cucumber is worth $5. So it turns out that over the course of technically a day, the worker could end up consuming produce worth much more than the value of the wage he is earning. The Gemara says, Tanakama says, okay, it's permitted. He has an entitlement to go ahead and he has an entitlement to consume produce. And even if that produce ends up being worth much more than the value of his labor, he still has license to do so. Rabbi Elazar Chasma Omer, Lo Yochal Paul Yeser Al Scharo. Rabbi Elazar says, no, that's not true. Your right of consumption is capped at the value of your labor. In other words, you can't consume more than the service you are providing. The Chum ultimately say that it's mutter. Now watch this. But we teach a person, don't be gluttonous. Don't be gluttonous and end up consuming a lot more produce. Why? In order not to close the door in your face. Meaning what I was saying, if Ruvain gets the name of a worker who eats a lot of stuff while on the job, even though that is his biblical entitlement, to the point that he consumes more produce than he's worth, or than the value of his labor, then what? His job prospects are going to be severely diminished. So I'll say, so we tell Ruvain, you're right, you're entitled. Just because you're entitled doesn't mean it's a good idea. So we help the worker. I will say this is like career coaching, right? We help the worker. We say to him, listen, buddy, if you want future job offers, stop eating so much on the job, especially with valuable produce. All right. The Gemara says, Ay chacham hainu Tanakama. So we'll say the first and third opinions seem to be saying the same thing. The Tanakama, which is the unnamed opinion of the Mishnah, and the Chum are both saying the same idea, namely that you could eat as much as you want. In other words, even if the value of produce consumed far surpasses the value of the labor, it's still permitted. To which the Gemara says, Ika b'nei malamdin. So we'll say it's possible that the nafkamina would be ultimately again malamdin, that do we go ahead and encourage the worker to eat less when the value of the produce is worth more than his service? According to the Tanakama, the answer would be no. You don't have to. Why should you have to teach him that? He's exercising his biblical entitlement. Let him eat whatever he wants. The Tanakama says no. In a case where the value of produce consumed is more than the value of his labor, we teach him not to eat so much. To which the Gemara says, the Tanakama, less than Malamdin, the Rabbana, is late Tanamdin. The other possibility is, perhaps we'll say enough community between the Chachamim and the Tanakama's Ravasi. What Ravasi say? The Ravasi, Afilu lo sachru ela livtzar eshkol echad ochlo. So it's very interesting. Ravasi says like this: let's say I hire a Ruvain, to go ahead and harvest one cluster of grapes. That's the job. All right, one cluster. So I'll say, so what's the chap? So Ruvain says, sure. And what does Ruvain end up doing? What does he end up doing? He eats the cluster of grapes. Technically speaking, that's a biblical entitlement. So Ravasi says, even if I only hired Ruvain to harvest one cluster of grapes, Ruvain has the right to eat. And if he ends up eating the entire cluster, that's his right. Va'am Ravasi, Afilu lo batzar ela eshkol echad ochlo. Now, we'll say another version of Rasi. Rasi said, even if Reuven only ended up harvesting one cluster of grapes, he has the ability to eat it. So in case number one, I only hired Reuven to harvest one cluster, and he ended up eating it. And Ravasi says it's mutter. In case number 2, I ended up hiring him for a bigger job, but he didn't end up yet. As of now, he's only harvested one cluster, and he's consumed it. To which the Gemara says, so those seem to be redundant rulings. Now they're both, I'll tell you why. Had it said the first ruling of one cluster, I might have thought that at the end of the day, maybe it's not mutter, because you must remember again, when is there entitlement for worker consumption? As the worker's putting it in the balabayas' basket. But in this case, there's nothing even to put into the balabayas' basket, because Reuben is eating all of it. So I might have thought that would be Aser Kamashmo and it's mutter. So I'll say, but where there is enough grapes, both to eat and to put into the balabayas' basket, so the Gemara says, Ema leisev bereisha v'hader lechol. I would have thought first, maybe the worker has an obligation first, put some produce in the basket, and then only afterwards go ahead and consume. V'yashmeinan baha, had it just said the second case, the efsha the kaimei besof, because ultimately again there's still produce left over to give to the balabayas. Aval hecha the efsh the lo efsha the kiyumei lebasof emalo. But in the case where if the worker eats, there's going to be nothing left for the balabayas. I might have thought that halacha lemaisa the worker can't consume, therefore tzvicha. Shabbos says, interestingly enough, just the statement of Ravasi, which is even in a case of limited produce, the worker still has entitlement to eat. And even technically, if he ends up eating up all of the produce, technically that's mutter. Now, obviously, goes without saying that in those kind of cases, we'll talk about this later on, that if the balabayas knows that there's a limited amount of produce, remember again, he could strategize with the worker beforehand, right? He can make a side deal with the worker to essentially give up his right of consumption for some type of payout, right? You could do that. The other possibility is, the difference between the Tanakama and the Chachamim, the Rav, so listen to this, it's really interesting. Rav said as follows, Matzasi Megillas Starim. I found literally again a hidden scroll. And what's the pshat with the hidden scroll? Take a look at Rashi. It's really very interesting. Megillah Starim, Megillah Timuna. I found the hidden scroll. Fisha Asher Lichtov Halachos. Kishahaya Shomea Dvar Chidish V'Yare L'Shacho Haya Kosva Umastira Min Ha'ayin. So let's listen to this. Once upon a time, Torah Baal Peh was really Baal Peh. Right? The verb, right? The oral law was really oral. So I said, but what would happen? Sometimes, someone would hear an idea and they didn't want to forget it. So what would they do? They'd write it down for themselves. Not for public consumption by themselves. So listen to this. So Rav says, I found one of these hidden scrolls with some divrei halacha on it. And what did it say? Masasim Megillas Starim Bei Rabbi Chia. I found one of these hidden scrolls in House of Rabbi Chia. V'kasavan, it says as follows. This is incredible. Isi ben Yehuda Omer. Isi ben Yehuda says, Kisavo kamreacha. The pasuk says, when you come into the vineyard of your fellow, of your friend. Now, both remember again, this is the pasuk that talks about the right to eat produce when you're working. So the Torah says, when you come into the vineyard of your friend, so bavias kol adam akasa medaber. Torah is talking about anyone is allowed to enter into the field and take grapes. Take grapes. V'amarav, Rav said, what? Lo shavki isi chay l'chol beria. Really? Isi is actually saying that halacha l'maisa, anyone can walk into the field and take grapes. Well, I will say, if anyone could walk into my field and take grapes, then you've ruined everyone. Then that means there's no commerce, there's no private property. There's no private property. That means anyone could take anything. That's impossible. Ravashi, Amrisa l'shmei tekamei Rav Kahana. I said this over from the Rav Kahana. Dilma ba'osim besu dasan da'avdu va'achlu. No. Maybe what Isi meant was as follows. He meant like this. What said that the Torah says, anyone who wants could come into my field and work my field. Now, and what's the payment? The payment is whatever food they could take during the harvesting. In other words, that while they're harvesting, let them eat while they're harvesting. And that's the halacha. That's what Isi ben Yehuda was saying. So in other words, I have a field. Reuven walks by. He's like, you know what? I got a couple of minutes anyway. Let me harvest some of Silber's produce. And while I'm harvesting, I'm going to eat. To which the Gemara says, Amrle afilu hachi, still that's not a good setup. Nechale le'inish la'oger agure, v'niktefe le'pardese, v'lonese kuli amma v'achlule. We'll say that's not how people want to run their fields. In other words, I don't want any stem guy walking into my field and thinking that he's a harvester and harvesting produce and then eating while he's harvesting produce. That's not what I want. I want to hire my own workers. I want to hire my own workers and have my own staff. So this setup doesn't work for me. To which the Gemara says, Ibaylahu. So we'll say the Gemara is suggesting maybe that's an afternoon between the Chum and the Tanakama. Ibaylahu. Okay, so we'll say, so fine. So that's our, so we'll say, so here's what we have. So our fundamental machlokes, so we'll say, is the following. Is a worker's right of consumption, is it capped at the value of his service, or does he have the ability to eat in a way that far surpasses the value of his labor? That's the shaila. So Rabbi Elazar ben Chisma says, no, you're only allowed to go ahead and eat up to the value of the service you're providing. Chachamim Tanakama say, no, you can eat as much as you want, even if it turns out that halacha l'maisa, the value of consumption far surpasses the value of labor. Now, the Gemara always just both say, clearly the Chachamim and the Tanakama are both espousing the same idea. We're just trying to figure out what's the nafkamina between them. Fine. Next, Ibaylahu. So both said, this is now perhaps one of the most yisodistic shilas that we'd be dealing with in this entire sugya, and has many, many ramifications. Here we go. Ibaylahu. Pa mishalahu ochal, o mishal shamayim ochal. So we'll say, when the worker eats, what is the nature of that entitlement? Is that what we call mishalo? Right? Mishalo, we'll say mishalo means, look at Rashi. So the Gemara says, mishalohu ochel v'tosefes scharhu shosif Torah. Do we look at the entitlement to eat as an additional wage? Right? In other words, the owner says, right, the Balabaya says, I'm paying you $10 an hour, and the Torah essentially adds on to the wage of the worker. And says, worker, okay, Balabais is giving you $10 an hour, Torah is giving you extra wage. What's the extra wage? Eat while you work. So do we view it as an add-on to the wage? Or, no, the Gemara says, oh, Mishal Shamayim Ochel. Or we'll say, maybe not. Rashi says, Mishal Shamayim b'matanas gemilas chasadim keshar matnos aniyim. Or maybe not. Maybe we'll say the entitlement to eat is a gift. It's a gift. It's like tzedakah. Now the worker might not need tzedakah, but it's like tzedakah. It's like leket, shichacha, peah. It's like all the other stuff that we give away. So we'll say, see here this, do we view the entitlement to eat? Do we view the entitlement to eat ultimately again as an add-on to the wage, or is it a gift from HaKadosh Baruch Hu? So I'll say, now watch this. So what does it matter? I'll tell you why it matters. Amar tnu li'ishti ubanai. This thing I will say, is the right assignable? Is it an assignable right? So again, I will say it depends. If it's considered to be a part of the worker's wage, then the worker has a right to assign his wage to someone else. If he says, you know what, I'm not exercising the right to consume the produce, I'm giving it over to my wife and my kids. Now, obviously, you can't give it over to everyone, because that would be a lot of produce to consume, but you can give it over to someone. So if it's part of my wage, I'm the worker, if it's part of my wage, I could assign it. If it's Mishal Shamayim, if it's a gift from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, gifts from God are non-assignable. Right? That's for you and you alone. So the Gemara says, "Iyamet mishalahu ochel yavinu lahu." If ultimately, again, it's mine, it's part of my wage, then it's assignable. But I will say if it belongs to, right, if ultimately Mishal Shamayim, if it belongs to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, then it's not assignable. So that means the Torah assigned it, right? If it's a gift, the gift was given to the worker, right? But ultimately, again, not given to anyone else. Incredible. So what's the halacha? We'll say, this is big kasha. So we'll say, by the way, and it's a kasha also, it's a good question because it gets to the root of what this is. Is this extra wage? Is this extra salary? Or is this a divine gift? That's our shayla. So Tashma, here we go. Pa ochel kishos va'afilu b'dinar kol seves va'afilu b'dinar. Remember, what did the Mishnah say? That the worker could consume produce even if the value of the produce far surpasses the value of his labor. So I'll say, if you say that at the end of the day that this is part of his wage, then okay. Then I will say, so I don't understand. So we're saying that you're going to hire him for 1/6 of a zuz. You're going to hire him for $10 and he can eat produce worth $20. So I'll say that's strange. That's strange that halakha l'maisa the extra wage is worth more than the primary wage. Rather, what you have to say is that no, the fact that he can eat produce, and even if the value of the produce far surpasses the labor, indicates to us that this is a gift from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. This is a matana gemilas hasadim. Sof. So say, but still, even if it's a divine gift, it sounds strange that the gift could be worth more than the actual value of the service. Ella, my isla. So we'll say, rather, what do you have to say? Rachmana zachila. Hachanami rachmana zachila. We'll say, rather, what you have to say is like this. This is a divine entitlement. Because Baruch Hu was mezakeh the worker with this amount. And that's it. And because of that, the value of the entitlement is almost irrelevant. HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, worker, this is not part of your wage. This is an additional gift, an additional entitlement that I give you, the working force. Right? It's yours, and therefore the value of it is irrelevant. So Tashma, Rabbi Elazar Chisma Omer, Lo Yochal Pal Yosar Ascharo, Rabbi Elazar Chisma said in the Mishnah, that a worker cannot eat in a way that surpasses the value of his labor. The Chachamim say it's mutter. So what's the machlokes? My lav b'hakamif. You will say this is the point of their contention. Temar sara mishalahu ochal. So we'll say one opinion says that the worker is the right of consumption is part of his salary. Umar sara mishal shemayim ochal. Tushmar says lo. The choli am mishalahu ochal. No, everyone agrees that the right of consumption of Osei is considered to be like a part of his salary. So the Gemara says, "V'halcha bekinafshecha kameflagi." Here, Osei, they're arguing about the drush on the pasuk kinafshecha. Marsav kinafshecha, but Devorah Leah nafshalav. So one opinion says kinafshecha, and the pasuk means that what? That when do you get this extra salary for something you're Moshe nefesh for? People say, "What are you Moshe nefesh for? What are you Moshe nefesh for? Your occupation, your work." Did we say we equate the worker? We've seen this before. The worker with the employer. Just like the employer has the right to muzzle himself, so to speak, to refrain from eating. So the Gemara says, af poel im chasamta pater. So too, if you quote unquote muzzle the employee, we spoke about that before. What does it mean to muzzle your employee? To make an arrangement that he's not going to eat is also pater. So Tashma, let's analyze a bit more. So Tashma was a great case over here. Nazir sha'amru tenu li'ishto banav in shomelo. Let's say a Nazir is harvesting a vineyard. Okay, so not the best idea in the world, right? But a Nazir is harvesting a vineyard, and he says, obviously I'm not eating from the grapes because a Nazir can't eat grapes. See, he says, I assign my entitlement to my wife and my kids. Let my family come and eat the grapes. So we'll say, what's talacha? In shomelo, we do not listen to him. It's non-assignable. So Gemara says, I amred mishalahu ochel amai in shomelo. Parents, we'll say, what does this show? That this is clearly a divine gift. Because if the entitlement to eat ultimately was part of his salary, then what? He should be able to assign it to whoever he wants. Which Gemara says, no, that's a different issue. Hasa mishum lacha amrina nazira schar lekarma lo sikra. I will say that's a different issue. The issue over there by the Nazir is we don't want a Nazir anywhere next to a vineyard. So therefore I will say, how do we dissuade him? We dissuade him by showing him that he can't assign any of his entitlements. But it's not necessarily a raya for our general question. So Tashma, Paul Sha'amar Tnuli Ishtiu Banai, we'll say first wide line on the bottom. So we'll say, the Gemara says, if a worker says, give my right of consumption to my kids, to my wife and my kids, in Shomelo, we do not listen to him. Vi Armed Mishalahu Ochel Amai in Shomelo. I will say, but again, if the entitlement to eat is really a salary extension, then why can't we go ahead and assign it to whoever he wants? The Gemara says, my poel, what's the worker in question over here? Nazir. Once again, it's a Nazir. And the Gemara says, I don't understand. Bahatanya Nazir. Bahatanya poel. So the Gemara says, so now it's the same halacha stated twice. We state Nazir twice, to which the Gemara says, Midi Gabi Hadadi time. Yeah, it happens. In other words, they didn't teach these two brises at the same time. So there are two brises dealing with Nazirim. Okay. So Tashma. How do we know that if a worker says, I want to assign my right of consumption to my wife and my kids, that we don't listen to him? The pasuk says, you may not put the produce that you are working with into your basket, speaking to the worker. So the idea over here is that the worker ever has a right of consumption himself, but he doesn't have a right to put it into his baskets. But you see the way the Torah frames the entitlement is that it's the worker's entitlement. Maybe here it's talking about Nazir again. Therefore, I'll say if it's a Nazir, the problem is not with Al Kali Chalositein. Rather, what's the problem? Mishum L'chalachamri Nazira. Who? You're right. So we'll say, since the Bryce is framing it as a lashon of Paul, it uses the pasuk by Paul. Okay, so we'll say, so remember, we'll say, still same shaila. You still the shaila. Everyone's agreeing now. We've outlined the entire parameters about how the worker is entitled to eat. Now we're trying to drill down to the ikar entitlement. Is the entitlement considered to be a salary extension, or is the entitlement to consume produce while eating a gift given to him by the Ribono Shalom? Nafkamina, is it assignable to a third party? So Tashma, if I hired a worker to go out and harvest, now Rashi says, Liavsham b'sad lasos ktzios. Liktzos will say really means to harvest, but really in this context, Rashi says to spread out, to dry in the field. To dry in the field. We'll say Amud Beis, it's not 92b. Hareza ochel upatra min hamaiser. So we'll say, so the worker is permitted to go ahead and eat, right? And the produce is patra from meiser. Okay, so we'll say, so now it makes sense. Remember, produce only becomes subject to meiser when it's finished. Here, because it's being spread out to dry, therefore it's not finished yet. Okay. Almanas she'ochal ani ubanai, o she'ochal b'ni bischari. So we'll say, what happens if the worker says, I'll work for you, right? On the condition that myself and my son have the right to eat from the figs. Or, for that matter again, on the condition that my son will eat as part of my wage. Hu ochal upater. So the worker himself is still allowed to eat. And it's not pater from mice. And it is pater from meiser. Ubeno ochal v'chayiv. But his son is allowed to eat also, but is chayiv in meiser before he eats. So the Gemara says, 1 second, so we'll say, but if we say that the worker's entitlement to consume the produce he's working with is an extension of his wage. If it's an extension of his wage, then he should be able to assign it, and therefore his son should be able to eat it, and his son should also be able to eat it without having to take meiser. So what's going on over here? Rabbi Shmuel Silber, Rabbi say it's different. In this case, Rabbi say over here, the problem is that when the worker says, when he's assigning it to his son, it looks like a sale. Rabbi say we saw this 2 days ago, that what happens when there is a sale, what happens in the context of a sale? A sale by definition causes the produce to be elevated to a finished state. And once the produce is in a finished state, it automatically becomes chayiv in meiser. So both say, so the issue over here is, even if technically speaking, maybe the right is assignable, but once you assign it, assigning it looks like a sale, and a sale automatically makes it like finished produce for meiser purposes. So Tashma, so both say, let's go right there. So we'll say, I hire a worker to work in my Natar Ravai. Now we'll say, remember again, what's Natar Ravai? Natar Ravai is fourth year produce. The halach is for first 3 years. Let's say I have a tree, right? And the tree is growing grapes, right? So the first 3 years is Arla. Fourth year, and Arla you can't eat the produce, right? Fourth year is called Ravai. Fourth year produce, right? Ravai. What's the halacha with Ravai? You're allowed to eat it. But like Meiser Sheni, it can only be consumed in Yerushalayim. So let's say, now watch this case. I hire a worker to harvest Ravai, fourth year produce for me. So I'll say, what's the halacha? And so the one says, now obviously here's the problem, right? So watch this. I have fourth year produce. I have a fourth year vineyard. Well, this would be Karam Ravai. So the halach is I'm allowed to eat it, right? But it has to be consumed in Yerushalayim. So meanwhile, again, my vineyard is in Tel Aviv. So I go ahead, I hire the worker. He comes in. He's ready to work. He's all excited, right? Because he's going to work. He's going to eat grapes. Then what happens? He finds out that it's Karam Ravai. So what's the halacha? He's not allowed to eat while he works. Then lo hodil, but I will say what happens. Now that's fine, assuming that he knew what he was getting into. I hired him to harvest Karam Ravai. He knew it. He shows up for it. He's not allowed to eat. What happens if I never divulge this information? So now he shows up, right, ready to work, but also what? Ready to eat. And then he finds out that this is a Karam Ravai. This is a fourth year vineyard. See, he can't eat. What's the halacha? If I did not tell him ahead of time, podeh. I have to redeem some produce and allow him to eat. Because Rabbi say, like Meiser Sheni, what can you do? You could redeem the produce, transfer the sanctity onto money, take the money to Yerushalayim, use the money in Yerushalayim to go out and purchase produce, and then this produce becomes unconsecrated, becomes mundane. So if I didn't tell him ahead of time that he was working with Karam Ravai, I have to redeem the produce, transfer the sanctity off the produce, and allow the worker to go ahead and eat while he works. But if you say that the worker's entitlement to eat is like a gift from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, then am I podel ma'achilan? Why do I have to redeem anything? Isur lo zoche l'rachamana. The Torah does not give him this right. Others will say, it sounds like the only reason you'd have to go ahead and redeem produce so that he could eat while he works is if you hold that eating is an extension or is a part of his wage, right? His salary. But if it's not part of his salary, but if it's a gift from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Ribono Shel Olam did not give him this gift. Why does he have to redeem anything? Hasa mishum demechse kemekach tos. They will say there it's different, right? Why? Because halacha l'maisa, it looks like a mistaken sale. In other words, they'll say, because I hired him to work in my field, and part of the entitlement of working in a field is eating produce, and I never divulged to him that it was revai produce. So it's like a mekach tos, it's like a mistaken transaction. So in order to go ahead and avoid a mekach tos, a mistaken, which technically speaking could lead to avoidable transaction, I should redeem property or redeem produce and allow him to eat it. All right, Rashi says over here, the mechse kemekach tos, hol ve'isni v'aval achila didei dilu b'tanai aval d'vischahu l'dam l'mekach. Fine. Same as Sefer. Rabbi says, so look at the end of that brayso. Nisparsu agulav, nispachtuhu chaviosav, hare'ilu lo yochu. So we'll say, now watch this. I hire a worker. We'll say, I had cakes of pressed figs. And then what happens? The cakes fell apart. So now I need someone to come in, collect the figs, and repress them into cakes. Right? Repress them into cakes. So we'll say, so now remember again, I hire a worker. Is the worker allowed to eat from that produce? The answer is no. Right? Why not? Because since it was already pressed into cakes of figs, it's already chayiv in meiser. Right? Remember again, a worker is only allowed to eat from pre-meiser produce. So Rabbi says, I hired him to repress the cakes into figs. Or for that matter, again, nispaschu chaviosav. My barrels of wine opened up, right? The seal on the covers broke, opened up, and I need someone to reseal my barrels of wine. Once again, once the wine is already in the barrel, even beforehand, it's subject to trumas and maestros. So the worker can't eat while they work in these cases. So we'll say in both of these cases, the worker is not allowed to eat when he works. So I'll say, so now what happens if I did not inform the worker? So in other words, I hired the worker. I said, Ruvain, I'm hiring you to work in my fig field, right? In my fig orchard. I don't know, whatever, fig grove, right? Whatever it is, right? So I said, I hire you. But I didn't tell him that, by the way, I'm hiring you to put figs back into their pressed cakes. So in other words, he thinks he's just coming to pick figs, in which case he would be entitled to eat. It turns out now he shows up, and halacha l'maisa again, he's not entitled to eat. So what's the halacha? The Gemara says, ma'asr ma'achila. In that case, I have to tie some of the figs and allow him to eat. Rabbi said that if you say that halacha l'maisa, when a worker gets to eat, it's not a form of a wage. Rather, what is it? What is it? It's just a gift from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Then am I ma'asr ma'achila? Then why do I have to tie anything to allow him to eat it? In this case, the Torah simply did not give him the gift. So if you don't get the gift, you're not entitled. So maybe someone will say, maybe in this case over here, you know what? It looks like a mekach tos. Why does it look like a mekach tos? I hired him to harvest figs. Right? He thinks he's coming to pick figs off the tree. Now it turns out that he's coming to go ahead and put figs back into pressed cakes. It doesn't look right. That's not nice. It's not nice. So Gemara says, well, if that's the case, so I understand why in the case of the figs. Right? So both say again, if I say, Ruvain, come to work with the figs in my field, I understand why he would think that he's coming to pick figs. And if it turns out that he's coming to repress figs, not repress figs, like repress figs, right? You know, I understand this. We want to treat everything with total respect. Right? The idea is repress the figs into cakes. Then halacha, again, I understand why that's a mekach tos. You want to say, Ella, this pasu chaliosa, my mekach tos, made the yada the itpul l'maiser. Rabbi said there is no mekach tos by the case of the wine, because also in the case of the wine, everyone knows that once wine is in the barrels, halach l'maiser, it's subject to trumas and maiser. So we'll stop over here. We'll pick up with this tomorrow. So we'll say, so just to know what we're leaving off with, right? So we'll say, so we're leaving off with our core shaila, which is what is the nature of the entitlement. Right? We spent all of this time highlighting what the nature of the entitlement is. Now we're trying to figure out what is the source of the entitlement. Is this an extra wage? Right? Is this part of salary? Or ultimately, again, is this considered to be a gift, a matana from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And now we're going through all of the nafkaminas associated with these two approaches. Resolution, Emir Hashem tomorrow. Shkoyach. Have a great day, everyone.